And I am very happy to welcome everyone here to the fifth in a series of presentations by the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State. I am Mary Hayes Gordon. I am part of the Oneida County Freedom Trail, and we are friends and partners with the Underground Railroad Consortium, and I am happy to be facilitating today's talk. We're in for a real treat today. I think many of us who are listening here have listened to, read, and used our presenters' research throughout our own careers. Today, we are having a presentation by Dr. Milton Sernett. He is Professor Emeritus of African American Studies and Histories from Syracuse University. He is a founding member of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and a member of this Underground Railroad Consortium. Dr. Sernett has authored two books of particular note, one titled Harriet Tubman, Myth, Memory, and History, and the other titled Abolition's Acts. I would like to turn it over now to Sage, who will give us a few housekeeping details before we introduce Dr. Sernett in the presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you for that welcome and introduction. My name is Sage Zarka, and I've been helping facilitate some of these webinars for the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State. As you may be able to see on our video, we are currently recording this webinar live for viewing later on at the Underground Railroad Consortium's website. That is urcnys.org. Once again, that's urcnys.org. And we are also live streaming on Facebook at the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State's Facebook page, which also is facebook.com/urcnys. So keep that in mind as we continue through this conversation. At the end of the presentation, we will conclude the live streaming portion, but we will stay open for a question and answer with our presenters. So once again, I'd like to thank Milton Sernett. I'd like to thank Mary Hayes Gordon and all of our participants today for joining us for the fifth webinar from the consortium.
Thank you, Sage. And as Sage mentioned, we will have questions at the end. Dr. Sernett has graciously agreed to take our questions at the end of his presentation. And as you can see also on the screen, he has titled his presentation based on his book, Abolition's Acts, Beriah Green, Oneida Institute, and African American Freedom. Dr. Sernett, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mary. Let's begin. Yes, it's based upon the book Abolition's Acts, which was published by Syracuse University. The cloth edition came out in 1986, and then the paperback edition in 2004. Beriah Green, born March 24th, 1795 in Preston, Connecticut, died May 4th, 1874 in Whitesboro, New York. He is buried in Grandview Cemetery overlooking Whitesboro. When I came to Syracuse University in 1975, I did not know anything really about Beriah Green, but I discovered him by reading the classic book, The Souls of Black Folk by W.E. Burghardt Du Bois. In chapter 5 of that book, Du Bois writes a tribute to Alexander Crummell, one of the students at Green School when Green was president, the Oneida Institute. Crummell was by then an esteemed intellectual. He was an Episcopal clergyman in Washington, D.C., and Du Bois was a young scholar. And Du Bois says that Crummell told him about Beriah Green and that how Crummell had spent 3 years of perfect equality under the tutelage of the bluff and kind-hearted Beriah Green. So I asked myself, who is this Beriah Green? And set out on a quest to recover his story, which was not easy because he went into a period of his latter part of his life where he had little contact with other abolitionists. I am actually proud to say I am 4 handshakes away from Beriah Green. Therein lies the story. When I was a Du Bois fellow at Harvard for a year, I met the distinguished librarian from the Moreland Spingarn collection at Howard University, Dr. Dorothy Porter. She was nearly 90 then, and I took her out to lunch one day. I was very concerned about getting her across the busy Harvard Square streets. I stepped out into the street. She grabbed my arm, saved my life. And at lunchtime, she told me this story, that when she was a young girl, she took piano lessons. And in the house she was taking piano lessons, Dr. Du Bois came as a guest. And so she shook the hand of Du Bois, who shook the hand of Alexander Crummell, who shook the hand of Beriah Green. So I am 4 handshakes away from my subject, Beriah Green. In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois writes, only a crank and an abolitionist like Beriah Green would have dared in the mid-1830s to admit Black youth to Oneida. We have very little in the way of autobiographical information about Beriah Green. He does say, though, I was born in New England and the lean soil and among the rocks and hills and streams of Connecticut. My infancy and childhood were spent among those who found wakeful industry, well conducted, and strict frugality resolutely maintained, requisite to a livelihood. This is the earliest image of Beriah Green. I would date it sometime in his early 40s. He was born in 1795. It's a daguerreotype, and it was discovered and sent to me by a descendant of Beriah Green out in California. Green attended Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont. He then went on to the Andover Theological Seminary north of Boston. He had a church at Paulet, Vermont, and one up at Maine, but he was more of a professor, academic type rather than a pastor, more of the scholar than the missionary. He had a thought about going as a missionary, but his health didn't permit, to a foreign country. Then comes an invitation to come out to Hudson, Ohio, which was part of the Connecticut Reserve. It was an area in northeastern Ohio that was, in a way, New England extended. Many people from New England and upstate New York went out there, and he went to Western Reserve College. This is an 1856 woodcut of the building of the college. And in the building on the far right, which is South College, which was built in 1830, Green arrives in 1830. In the basement, there was a chapel. And on 4 successive Sundays, Green, who lived in this house, which still stands in Hudson, Ohio. And by the way, we should mention that John Brown was in Hudson, Ohio, ran a tannery at the same time that Green was there. I believe they did meet once because in a letter, Green talks about preaching a sermon in one of the local churches, and in the rear of the room where he was preaching, a figure appeared who was, he later found out, John Brown. This is the foundation of the John Brown Tannery. Well, Green and his fellow students become interested in the publication of the Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. One of the students went home for Christmas vacation, came back with a copy of the Liberator, and now the faculty and students were divided, and the trustees. Some were for colonization, some were for the Garrisonian notion of immediate emancipation. Green took to the pulpit in that chapel basement, preached 4 sermons in November and December, in which he castigated, of course, slaveholders, but more to the point, he angered the trustees and more conservative students and faculty by arguing that Northerners who did not take up the cause of the slave were as guilty as were Southerners. And so the trustees, the conservative trustees, forced Green out. And he now comes back east to upstate New York, to the old burned over district, and takes up a position here just between Utica and Whitesboro along the Erie Canal at something called the Oneida Institute, which you can see up here. There's the Mohawk River and the canal and the Syracuse Utica Railroad. Now, Charles Grandison Finney, the great revivalist, had set ablaze upstate New York in the 1820s and 1830s. And as a result, we have something called the Second Great Awakening, which was a religious revival movement in the early 19th century that appealed to people because it had them come to the notion that a new millennial age was about to dawn, and that if they needed to reform the nation of its ills before Christ would come back, and then it would be a 1,000-year golden age. George Washington Gale, a Presbyterian clergyman up at Western New York, began to gather some of the young men from Finney's revivals who were interested in getting an education, a theological education that was more pragmatic. They might have gone to Auburn Theological Seminary in Auburn, New York, a Presbyterian institution, but they wanted a more practical education that could get them out onto the Western frontier and to spread the gospel without the long academic pursuit that it would require at a place like Auburn. So Gale starts bringing them together at his farm in Western New York, and then eventually comes down to Whitesboro, where on a 115-acre farm that had belonged to Hugh White, a Revolutionary War veteran and one of the pioneers of Whitestown, here they set up the Oneida Institute. In the center, we have the classrooms and the chapel, and on the left and the right, we have the dormitories. It began as the Oneida Academy in 1827, and it was chartered as the Oneida Institute of Science and Industry in 1829. It was a manual labor school. The students were required to work at least 3 hours a day in the fields, in the print shop, in the carpenter shop, and they could then offset some of the costs of being members of the school. At one time, they had to turn away 500 prospective students. Here's the location of the school. Here's Main Street in Whitesboro and Ellis Street right here. There's a throughway. So this gives you an idea of the rough location. And here is on a map. We have 3 locations in Whitesboro that are relevant to our story. The school, here it is called Whitestown Seminary because this was the successor institution. The Presbyterian Church, where Green got into trouble with conservatives, and his house, where he lived in at the time of his death at the intersection of corner of Brenner Street and Main Street, about 150 yards from that corner. Now, one of the students at Oneida Institute was Theodore Dwight Weld, sometimes known as the Thunderer of the West. Weld and a number of the older students were not encouraged by George Washington Gale. He was anti-slavery, but not abolitionist enough. And so they rafted down the Allegheny River, left the school before Green comes. Green comes on August 7th, 1833. And they go down to Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. It is here, by the way, that Calvin Stowe is teaching, the husband of Harriet Beecher Stowe. These students then become known as the Lane Rebels because they are too abolitionist for the more conservative faculty. They leave Lane Theological Seminary after a series of debates. As this marker says, the Lane Seminary debates marked the shift in American anti-slavery efforts from colonization to abolition. So Weld and his allies go up to Oberlin, depicted here, and help make Oberlin into an abolitionist school. Now, when Green comes to the United Institute, he comes on 2 conditions. He must not be hindered in advancing the Emeritus cause, sparked by Garrison, and he must be able to admit students without regard to race or class. It was not an auspicious time to start an interracial school. Prudence Crandall, pictured here, had tried that at her female boarding school in Canterbury, Connecticut. The community was opposed to it. They broke the school's windows. They tried to burn it down. They forced its closure. After Crandall admitted Sarah Harris, a 20-year-old African-American woman. I just found out a few days ago that one of the female students at Crandall's school was Julia Williams. And after Crandall's school closed, she went to the Noyes Academy. And when that was closed, here's the Noyes Academy, chartered in 1834 by Samuel Noyes and other Canaan citizens, opened in 1835, but outraged opponents used a team of oxen to drag the academy building down Canaan Street and force the Black pupils out of town. So this experiment in interracial education also failed. Note who attended, though: Henry Highland Garnett, Alexander Crummell, and Thomas Simpkins Sidney. Those 3 students, African-American students, When they heard that Greene was opening his school to African Americans, they went out to Whitesboro. Julia Williams, who had been at Putin's Crandall School, comes to the Noyes Academy. Then when Garnett goes out to Whitesboro, she goes to, and according to this one source, she was a student at the Oneida Institute. And in 1841, she will marry Henry Highland Garnett. I have yet to find her name in one of the catalogs of the Oneida Institute and need to get back into the archives of the Oneida History Center, where I donated all the materials related to the book, and see if I can't find her name. Here is an artist's rendition of the 80 pairs of oxen that haul the school out into the swamp. So Green School admitted more African-American students than any other institution of the state. Students hid freedom seekers on campus in the dormitories and became evangelists for immediatism. Some of the more prominent African-American students was Alexander Crummell. Henry Highland Garnett became a Presbyterian clergyman. Jermaine Wesley Logan, who is well known for his work with the Underground Railroad in Syracuse, and especially his involvement with the Jerry Rescue, attended the school. He was African Methodist Episcopal Zion clergyman. I've not found evidence that he actually graduated, but he did teach a Sunday school in Utica when he was in Utica. So here's a list of the known African-American students at Oneida Institute. And it's difficult to determine which students were African-American in the rosters that Green includes in some of the student catalogs or the Institute catalogs, because he had no interest in identifying them by race. He was opposed, we might add, to separate schools for African Americans and whites. He firmly believed in an interracial school. But some of these individuals we can follow in their careers as they went out and became abolitionists. So this is the 1837 junior class catalog. And on this, you can see the names of Alexander Crummell, Amos Freeman, Thomas Sidney, and some of these others may well be African-American, but it is hard to know unless you know them from some other source. He gives here their residences, where they came from, and also the rooms where they lived in the dormitories. Josiah B. Grinnell, who enrolled at Oneida Institute in 1841, after his time there, he went out to Iowa and he helped to found Grinnell College. But this is his description of the makeup of the student body when he came in 1841. Emancipators, boys from Cuba, mulattoes, a Spanish student from the island of Minorca, an Indian named Kunkapat, Black men who had served as sailors or as city hackmen, also the purest Africans escaped from slavery, sons of American radicals, Bible students scanning Hebrew verse with ease, in the place of Latin odes, enthusiasts, plowboys, and printers, also real students of elegant taste, captured by the genius of President Greene. Greene's son, Samuel, one of 130 students enrolled in 1835, wrote his maternal grandmother, Hannah Denby, "Here at Oneida Institute, we are all abolitionists, to a man, trustees, faculty and students. Beriah Green was an ardent champion of abolition and immediatism and opposed to the notion of colonization. In 1834, he went to Utica and he had a series of debates with Joshua Danforth, who was a representative of the American Colonization Society. Of course, Green's friends believe he bested Danforth, but Green was hung in effigy by the anti-abolitionists. So Green was active outside of the Oneida Institute in carrying the flag of abolitionism. When the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed in Philadelphia in 1833, that December, initially they had difficulty in finding somebody who would preside over the meeting. But Green said something to the effect, do we not have timber enough among themselves? And so his friends said, well, why don't you chair the meeting? And so he did. So he was the presiding officer, this young and fair-haired man, as John Greenleaf Whittier described him, of the American Anti-Slavery Society's founding convention. And this is their constitution. But back home in Whitesboro, not all was going well. The Reverend David Ogden, the pastor of the Presbyterian Church, where Green, the students, and most of the faculty attended, was a colonizationist and a conservative. And he and the conservative trustees forced Green and Green's allies out of the church. Green then went across the street with his little band of followers and founded a Congregationalist church, a come-outer church, or a free church. And Green's offense, according to the Reverend Ogden, was that he had delivered this talk, Things for Northern Men to Do, a discourse delivered Lord's Day evening, July 17th, 1836. And once again, his argument was that Northerners needed to do more than to just criticize Southerners for slavery. The North has much to do with American slavery. It has deeply involved her in guilt. It is exposing her every day and at 1,000 points to the most mortifying insults and to the deadliest injuries. In what dreams do we indulge? Can the South be rent with earthquakes, scathed with thunderbolts for crimes clearly national, while the North looks on with the airs of an unconcerned spectator? No, no. If the ship, to change the figure, strikes on the rocks, which dead ahead lift up their horrid forms, must we not go down together, swallowed up by the same waves? The very vitals of humanity are concerned in the strife. If the yoke of the enslaved is broken, humanity will escape from the incubus by which she has been well nigh suffocated. She will breathe freely again. This is from the Friend of Man. The Friend of Man paper is a very important abolitionist periodical. It was published originally in Utica by William Goodell, but the students at the Oneida Institute took up the printing of it on their printing press. Cornell University has now made available The Friend of Man in digital form. Green was not without his supporters. Alvin Stewart, the Utica lawyer, was one of those. He was on the board of trustees, though Green was upset with Stewart in that Stewart did not send his own sons to the Oneida Institute. Stewart and Green then and others call for a New York State Anti-Slavery Society. And a group of abolitionists, some 700 or so, assembled in October of 1835 at the Bleecker Street Presbyterian Church. A mob breaks in, disrupts the organizing meeting. Gerrit Smith, who was a supporter of the Oneida Institute, but still a supporter of colonization, saw the issue of free speech as being at risk, and so he invites the abolitionists, some 400 or so, to come down to Peterborough. There's the Gerrit Smith estate. This is the Presbyterian Church, which was later called the Evans Academy because the Evans Academy moved from here to here. And there they complete the work of organizing the New York State Anti-Slavery Society. And this is a book I wrote about that organization, and it includes some of the original documents from those meetings, such as the proceedings of the New York State Anti-Slavery Convention. The school was increasingly in difficulty because financially it had always been in debt. Some years the faculty did not get their salaries. Then there was the financial panic of 1837, and Gerrit Smith was not able to contribute as much as he had. And the New York State Anti-Slavery Society and others were not making good on the promises they had of financial support. So in his last valedictory address, Greene says, "We don't deny that we have been traduced, derided, opposed. We confess that we are called onion grubbers." And the Negro school, fashion had tossed up her pretty nose at us. The grim ecclesiastic, as he passes by on the other side, that's an allusion to the story of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, exclaims with a knowing air, "That will never do." I might mention here that in 1841, Greene writes Joshua Leavitt, an abolitionist who was the editor of the Emancipator, and tells Leavitt that Greene and the Oneida Institute would welcome the Mende captives from the Amistad story to come to Oneida. And he tells Leavitt that there is room in the dormitories for them. He even describes exactly what the furnishings would be like. And by 1843, Greene himself is living on the campus because his house burns down that September. He loses much of his library, many of his papers. He loses the place for the printing of some of his books, and he sets up housekeeping on the Institute. In May of 1844, he moves from the Institute grounds to the Bartlett place on Hart's Hill. This had a house, barn, and 14 to 15 acres. The house was too small for his wife and 8 children. He brought 7 children with him from Hudson, Ohio, and they had 1 more while in Whitesboro. Then in 1845, he purchases a home and lot in the village known as the Mrs. Mame House, which is located on the south side of Main Street, about 150 feet east of Brainerd Street. That house may still be standing, though until we get into the deeds, we don't know. When Greene published his book, Miscellaneous Writings, in 1860, on the title page, he gives greetings from the old hive. And so it is somewhat uncertain as to the location of which house he's representing to be the old hive, because at another point, he talks about taking freedom seekers into the old hive. This is what the Oneida Institute looked like at the time of its sale. in 1844 to the Whitestown Seminary. By that time, Green is, for all practical purposes, without students or faculty, and is facing the reality of having to close the school. Whitestown Seminary was an institution of the Free Will Baptists. They'd had a school over in Clinton that was a domestic female seminary, and they brought that here. And they also brought a school, theological seminary, from Maine. And they had this school from roughly 1845 until 1874. In August 1838, Green writes to Garrett Smith, "Since I last saw you, I have made a new acquaintance who exerts a powerful influence upon me. Thomas Carlyle is his name. He seems to be an Englishman. Have you seen his French Revolution?" That is his book about the French Revolution, of which Carlyle was very critical. Here's Thomas Carlyle. He was a Scottish essayist, philosopher, writer, who soured on democracy and who came up with the notion that there should be society ruled by the wise or by the great man. And Green, who had too soured on democracy because the political parties of the day had done very little to advance the cause of freedom, had adopted some of Carlyle's thinking and became increasingly isolated. Nevertheless, Green's friends praised him for being perhaps the most well-known Northern advocate of the notion that the Bible could not be a refuge for those who advocated slavery. Southerners like to use the Old Testament to argue for slavery, but Green went to the New Testament and there found an argument against slavery. Two books exist by Green. One is miscellaneous writings, and the other was sermons and discourses with brief biographical hints. It's the miscellaneous writings of Beriah Green, I'll correct myself here, which has that frontispiece which references the old hive. So he's living in the old hive when, I guess we'll conclude, in 1841. James Gillespie Birney, the former Kentucky slaveholder, and then later the presidential candidate of the Liberty Party, wrote in July 15th, 1852, "Of all my friends and acquaintances in the abolitionist ranks, and they certainly contain a great deal of talent, Beriah Green's arguments strike me as most forcible and convincing." So now we're back to the plan of Whitesboro, and the greenhouse is right here. Now, whether that is the old hive or not, I'm still not sure. Here's the Whitestown Seminary. None of these buildings belong to the Oneida Institute. The Oneida Institute buildings were wooden buildings built on brick foundations. This is the Whitestown Seminary. Here's the Whitestown Sanatorium. So this is a later institution. Today, the funeral home's up here, and that brick building, which you'll see in a second, is in the back. Many years ago, when I was on my sojourn to learn more about Beriah Green, a professor emeritus from Hamilton, and I went here, and he told me he had been up inside this room and that he had heard the voices of Henry Highland and Garnett. I didn't have the heart to tell him that that building belonged not to the Oneida Institute, but to the Whitestown Seminary. It was built in 1869 as Walcott, W-A-L-C-O-T-T Hall, by William D. Walcott, who was a local textile maker. Today it houses the Everson Incorporation, which is a manufacturer of electronic scoreboards for athletic purposes. At one time, it was the Anchor Knitting Mill. This is a 1913 picture of that. This is the picture of Beriah Green that you usually see. Here he says, "I present the old man's mouth." And at the end of his life, he was isolated. At one point, his brother, Jonathan Green, who had gone as a missionary to the Sandwich Islands, later called the Hawaiian Islands, writes Garrett Smith, "What ails Beriah?" Well, by this time, Beriah is even estranged from Garrett Smith. And Smith can only write back that he has no understanding of what ails Beriah Green. John Greenleaf Whittier, the Quaker poet who lived at Oak Knoll, upon hearing of Beriah's death on the 10th day of 1874, "I am pained to learn of the death of that noble man, Beriah Green, how thick the cypress shadows fall, and how few are left of those whom I met at the Anti-Slavery Convention of 1833. The world never knew, that is, understood Beriah Green. He was a great man morally and intellectually. He has died as he would have wished to die, lifting up his voice for God and humanity." Green died in 1874. He had gone down to the town hall there in Whitesboro to deliver a temperance lecture against the granting of any new liquor licenses. And while giving the lecture, he simply swooned, fell over backward, and died. Well, I've been on this quest for a long time to learn more about Beriah Green. There I am, fresh-faced, but not sandy-haired, many years ago with our son Matthew, who was then probably about 7 years old. And I would drag him around on my various historical quests, and he did so with some reluctance. But later on, when he grew up, he confessed that he enjoyed these sojourns. And so I dedicated Abolitionist Acts to, he reads, "To my son Matthew, despite a fascination with mythical beasts, confess he actually enjoyed accompanying his dad on research explorations." Green is buried there overlooking Whitesboro in Grandview Cemetery. And the epitaph on his tombstone is, "He that doeth righteousness is righteous." And that is from the New Testament, from the first epistle of John. The book then. The image on the book is a sketch from a British abolitionist source. You find the tree of slavery and the two axemen cutting it down because it is loaded with all the villainies of human nature, knavery and brutality and treachery and villainy and murder and so on. Well, Green thought of his school as his axe, his students, that they would go out into the world and that they would destroy the tree of slavery. But the axe was also important to him personally. Throughout his life, whenever he was under duress, he would resort to the wood pile, and he became a firm believer in that the health of the body and the mind belong together. And so with that, we end the story of Beriah Green. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milt. That was, again, very informative. Even having read the book, the new things that you bring, we always get more each time.